President Trump pledges an end to third world mass migration. We get into it. All the details surrounding the Afghan national terror attack against two members of the National Guard. Also, Somali welfare fraud. All of it tying together. We'll get into it first. This is it. The biggest sale we do all year guaranteed. Daily Wire Plus is now half off for a limited time. Get access to every show, movie, and the Pendragon cycle, Rise of the Merlin. Head on over to dailywire.com/subscribe. Well, over the course of the Thanksgiving weekend, President Trump went into high gear talking about the necessity to deport all migrants from the third world and to stop further third world migration into the United States. This has been a long time coming. Obviously, the president of the United States had said this all the way back in 2015, 2016. When he took office in 2017, you'll recall that one of the very first things that he did was attempt a migration moratorium from a series of countries where it'd be very, very difficult to vet people. Well, now all of this is coming to a head. On Thursday, President Trump said he would permanently pause all immigration from what he called third world countries, according to NBC News. He demanded a program of reverse migration as he intensified his rhetoric after a National Guard shooting that happened in Washington, D.C. While we were out on Thanksgiving break, there was a horrifying shooting. 2 National Guard members shot in Washington, D.C. by an Afghan refugee who had apparently been working with the CIA while he was in Afghanistan and then migrated to the United States as part of Joe Biden's gigantic shipment of Afghan refugees into the United States. The vetting process could have been flawed or he could have been radicalized. We'll get into that in a moment. President Trump said, quote, "Even as we have progressed technologically, immigration policy has eroded those gains in living conditions for many. I will permanently pause migration from all third world countries to allow the U.S. system to fully recover, terminate all of the millions of Biden illegal admissions, including those signed by sleepy Joe Biden's auto pen, and remove anyone who is not a net asset to the United States or is incapable of loving our country, end all federal benefits and subsidies to non-citizens of our country, denaturalize migrants who undermine domestic tranquility, and deport any foreign national who is a public charge, security risk, or non-compatible with Western civilization. These goals will be pursued with the aim of achieving a major reduction in illegal and disruptive populations, including those admitted through an unauthorized and illegal auto pen approval process. Only reverse migration can fully cure this situation. Other than that, happy Thanksgiving to all, except those that hate, steal, murder, and destroy everything that America stands for. You won't be here for long. Again, all this happening in the aftermath of a dual set of stories, one of them being the Afghan national shooting up a couple of members of the National Guard and killing one. The other story being this unbelievable story of Somali welfare fraud happening in the state of Minnesota. Kristi Noem of the Department of National Security, she said that President Trump is determined to stop all processes from third world countries. Here is what the Secretary of Homeland Security had to say.
The president is absolutely determined to stop all processes at this point in time from third world countries until we can have a thorough opportunity to go through these individuals, know that they're here for the right intentions, and that they even should be in our country to begin with.
The State Department then announced immediately that they would pause visa issuance for individuals traveling on Afghan passports and said, quote, "The department is taking all necessary steps to protect U.S. national security and public safety." Again, all of this is happening in the aftermath of that terror attack by an Afghan national who worked with a CIA-backed group during the war in Afghanistan. According to the Washington Post, that National Guard shooting suspect was in one of the CIA's so-called zero units. The zero units were units that were working with the CIA in order to ensure security in Afghanistan. According to the Washington Post, the person whose name was Rahmanullah Lakanwal, 29, apparently drove across the country to carry out Wednesday's attack and was detained moments after opening fire on Sarah Beckstrom, 20, an Army specialist from West Virginia, and Air Force Staff Sergeant Andrew Wolf, 24. He used a .357 Smith & Wesson revolver. Beckstrom died of her injuries. Wolf is critically injured as well. Now, apparently, he came to the United States in September 2021. You'll remember that is when Joe Biden disastrously withdrew from Afghanistan in the most ignominious defeat in modern American history. He just decided to pull out full scale and hand the country back to the Taliban with no plan for transition, no security protocols followed, nothing. And then, because the United States was abandoning 38 million people to the predations of the Taliban, the United States, under Joe Biden, decided to bring in tens of thousands of Afghan refugees. It'd be very difficult to vet all of those people, considering, again, the security situation in Afghanistan, a terror-rich haven, not particularly good. Apparently, this person worked with the U.S. government, including the CIA. He entered the United States in 2021 as part of Operation Allies Welcome, a Biden-era program. And then he was actually granted asylum under President Trump this April, according to a law enforcement official briefed on the investigation. He had worked with the U.S. government, including the CIA. CIA Director John Ratcliffe said that the shooter was a member of a partner force in Kandahar. He was part of one of the CIA's Zero units. They were involved in combat missions to seize or kill suspected terrorists. They were involved in anti-terror raids. Now, as we're going to discuss in a moment, unclear whether he was a radical when he was shipped to the United States or whether he self-radicalized while in the United States. Elliot Ackerman, writing for the Free Press, describes what these Zero units did. He said the CIA-sponsored counterterrorism pursuit teams, later known as Zero units, were created in the days after 9/11 to hunt senior members of al-Qaeda and the Taliban. The Zero units, unlike the Afghan army, worked directly for the United States government. They were recruited from throughout Afghanistan, given specific military training, and performed many dangerous missions, among them night raids against high-level targets. The Zero units existed for the entire duration of the war, and given their classified nature, they allowed administrations of both parties to have more troops operating in Afghanistan than was reported to the United States public. At any given time, the number of Zero unit soldiers numbered in the thousands, operating from bases all around the country, including Kandahar. So, as Elliot Ackerman points out, the Zero units were people who were working closely with the United States military. Also, this person would have been vetted, according to Elliot Ackerman. To join elite Zero units, he writes, Afghan volunteers were subjected to extensive vetting, including background checks and polygraphs. This shooter first entered the Zero units in 2012 and served under both the Obama and Trump administrations. He was granted humanitarian parole into the U.S. in 2021, and then again was granted asylum when his case came under review in 2025 under the Trump administration. Kristi Noem, Department of Homeland Security head, she says actually that when he was shipped in, he wasn't a problem. He was radicalized later through connections already in the country, which, by the way, is significantly more dangerous. Okay, that is a massive problem, like a much worse problem than just bringing people in from cultures that are non-communicative and non-coalescing with Western civilization. That you can stop, right? That you can do what President Trump is saying. Just stop immigration from third world countries, as he says. But if, in fact, there are people who are being brought in who initially are somewhat friendly to the United States or have worked with the United States and then are being radicalized in the United States, you have to start asking some pretty serious questions about which organizations in the United States here, like at home, are actually radicalizing people. And again, this would fit with a different pattern. The pattern would not be we're bringing in migrants who are then committing crimes, right? An illegal immigration problem. Then what you'd really be talking about is an Islamicization problem, a radical Islamicization problem inside the United States. And it would fit with lone wolf attacks, ISIS-inspired attacks, or ISIS-connected attacks. And there have been a whole list of people in the United States who have been radicalized inside the United States by ISIS, associated groups, social media. And that ranges from the Fort Hood shooting all the way through the 2025 New Orleans truck attack, in which an ISIS-inspired person killed 14 people. It's amazing how terrorist attacks like that get completely memory behold. Like, you don't even remember that happening in 2025. But it killed 14. That was, again, the beginning of this year. And it killed 14 people. And we've already forgotten about it because the way that the media works, if somebody is inspired by ISIS or a radical Islamic group and they commit a terror attack in the United States, we just memory hole it. The same thing happened in 2016 by the Orlando nightclub shooting, in which a shooter killed 49 people. You remember, at the Orlando Pulse nightclub, the deadliest mass shooting in American history at that time. And the shooter, in that case, pledged allegiance to ISIS. And instead, we got a national debate about whether Christians were too intolerant toward gay people, even though it was an Islamic terror attack, or the 2015 San Bernardino terror attack, in which a couple of people who communicated with ISIS via encrypted messages killed 14 people and injured 22 others. Okay, so radicalization in the United States is a massive problem. And by the way, requires the FBI and the DOJ to actually do the thing that they are supposed to do. Track down the groups doing the radicalizing, follow them around, monitor the places where the radicalization is occurring. And that is a significantly harder problem to solve. Really, a much harder law enforcement problem to solve than just shutting the borders, which is what President Trump is attempting to do. By the way, these are not mutually exclusive. You can shut the borders to immigration and mass migration from third world countries, and we should. But also, in this particular case, it seems like the problem, maybe it was letting the guy in the country in the first place. That's a fair argument. But at the time, if he was working with the Zero units and had been vetted, then the real problem is how he got radicalized after he came to the United States. Again, you can say he shouldn't have come in anyway. Because if you're coming from a third world country, why is your first place of respite the United States? Go somewhere else. There are plenty of other countries on planet Earth.
We believe he was radicalized since he's been here in this country. We do believe it was through connections in his home community and state, and we're going to continue to talk to those who interacted with him, who were his family members, talk to them. So far, we've had some participation, but anyone who has information on this needs to know that we will be coming after you.
Apparently, there were warning signs. Apparently, there are always warning signs. The New York Post reports that a leading national refugee agency was warned multiple times. The Afghan terror suspect accused of murdering one National Guard member and critically injuring another was spiraling into mania and mental illness beginning in 2023. Again, that goes to the theory that this person was, in fact, vetted when he came into the United States. That's why, presumably, he was granted asylum by the Trump administration in 2025. Remember, entered in 2021 under Joe Biden. 4 years later, was granted full asylum by the Trump administration. And we'll get to Kristi Noem's kind of non-response response to that problem in a moment. Apparently, the shooter's behavior was so disturbing, a local community advocate reached out to a refugee organization for help. According to emails to the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants seen by the Associated Press, the community member wrote, quote, Rahmanullah has not been functional as a person, father, and provider since March of 2023. He quit his job that month. His behavior has changed greatly. The community member said he feared that Lakanwal had become suicidal. The 29-year-old Afghan refugee, of course, was brought to the United States in 2021, and he moved to Bellingham, Washington, with his wife and their 5 young sons. Apparently, he struggled to assimilate, which, again, goes to mass migration from third world countries, failed to hold down a steady job or commit to learning English. Apparently, alternating between periods of dark isolation and reckless travel, he sometimes spent weeks in his darkened room, not speaking to anyone, not even his wife or his older kids. These manic episodes, he would take off in the family car and drive nonstop. He failed to stay in contact with the Washington State Department of Social and Health Services, as was mandated by the terms of his entry into the United States, except for interim weeks where he would do the right things according to the email. And apparently, when his wife would leave him with the kids for a week, traveling to visit relatives, his kids would go to school unwashed in dirty clothes without even having eaten. Apparently, there were concerns raised about his kids. So, red flags aplenty, and nothing was done. We'll get to more on this in a moment. First, the holidays are here. That means it's time for comfort, joy, really good food. Impress your relatives with gourmet holiday meals from our ad partner, Cook Unity. Let their chefs handle healthy meal prep with festive, nutritious dishes like maple whipped sweet potatoes and candied yam cake, available for a limited time in select markets. Let's be honest, cooking quality meals takes time. It doesn't have to be your time. With Cook Unity, you get chef-crafted dishes delivered fully cooked and ready to heat up in as little as 5 minutes, so there's no cooking, shopping, or cleanup to worry about. Cook Unity gives more time back to you and spending it with the people you care about without the worry of a meal well made. You can enjoy culinary masterpieces for way less than restaurants or takeout with commitment-free subscriptions starting as low as $11 per meal. Just last week, Justin was raving about the penne with spicy pink sauce. He's getting ready for the holidays. Old-fashioned glazed holiday ham, ultimate holiday turkey dinner, the whole deal. Cook Unity's chef lineup has Food Network favorites, James Beard Award winners, restaurateurs whose names you'd recognize from the best dining scenes across the country, complete with hand-picked, fresh, seasonal flavors. Taste comfort and craftsmanship in every bite from the award-winning chefs behind Cook Unity. Go to cookunity.com/Ben or enter code Ben before checkout to get 50% off your first order. That's 50% off your very first order by using code Ben or going to cookunity.com/Ben. Also, this episode is sponsored by Quo. Let's be honest, traditional phone systems weren't built for how businesses actually work today. When you miss a call, you're not just missing a conversation, you're actually losing business. Quo, formerly Open Phone, is the modern alternative designed to help you work smarter, build stronger relationships, never miss an opportunity. If you're tired of juggling multiple phones or being chained to a landline, Quo is exactly what your business needs. As the #1 business phone system, Quo streamlines all your customer communications through a simple app on your phone or computer, and you can literally run your business from anywhere. What's really smart about it is how your entire team can share one number and collaborate on calls and texts like they're working from a shared inbox, which keeps response times lightning fast and customers genuinely happy. Here's where it gets interesting. Quo's built-in AI does the heavy lifting by automatically logging calls, creating summaries, even automating your next steps. Their AI agent can actually answer calls, qualify leads, and route customers to the right team member, so you never have to worry about leaving customers hanging even after hours. Whether you're flying solo or leading a growing team, Quo keeps everyone connected while helping you deliver those standout customer experiences that make all the difference. It's no wonder over 90,000 businesses are already using it. Quo is offering my listeners 20% off your first 6 months at quo.com/Ben. That's QUO.com/Ben. You can even keep your existing number for free. Quo, no missed calls, no missed customers. Now, Kristen Welker over at NBC News was asking Kristi Noem about this, and she points out, you're pointing out he shouldn't have come in 2021. That's fine, but you guys granted him asylum in 2025.
But I just want to be very clear about this because his asylum was approved in April of this year on the Trump administration's watch. So just to be very clear, was there a vetting process in place to approve that asylum request?
Yeah, the vetting process all happened under Joe Biden's administration.
But was he vetted when he was granted asylum? Are you saying he wasn't vetted when he was granted asylum?
Vetting is happening when they come into the country, and that was completely abandoned under Joe Biden's administration.
Okay, so, again, yes and no. I mean, the answer here is yes and no. And two problems can be problems at once. One can be the original vetting procedure or whether the initial place for Afghan refugees to go in the aftermath of Joe Biden's cowardly withdrawal from Afghanistan should have been the United States. My answer there would have been no. It should not have been the United States. We should have figured out someplace else for people to go. But then again, I was also not an advocate of withdrawing precipitously from Afghanistan in the first place without any sort of transitional plan for the government to remain. And then there's the second question, which is the radicalization question, which remains a very, very hot topic. Meanwhile, again, this is a bigger issue than just this one shooter. Apparently, according to the Department of Homeland Security, investigators arrested an Afghan national over the weekend who allegedly made a social media post about building a bomb and threatening to blow up a building in Fort Worth, Texas. Mohammed Dawood Alakoze's arrest took place on Tuesday, according to Tricia McLaughlin, an assistant secretary with DHS. This person was arrested on state terror charges and is now being held at a corrections center in Tarrant County, Texas, according to court records. Apparently, this particular would-be bomber posted a video of himself on TikTok indicating he was building a bomb with an intended target of the Fort Worth area. So at least he picked up the American custom of posting all your worst ideas on TikTok. At least that's how he was caught. He was arrested on Tuesday by the Texas Department of Public Safety and the FBI as well. So even Democrats are on the defensive about this at this point. Senator Mark Kelly of Arizona, he was asked about the vetting of Afghan immigrants. He said, listen, I don't think there's any question that everybody needs better vetting. There's no question about that.
Are you saying that all 190,000 Afghans in America should be re-vetted, that the process?
No, I'm not saying that.
Okay.
People should be vetted. Hey, if you identify, a certain number of individuals that you have another question about, I think that's fine to do that. There needs to be an investigation and find out, why did this guy do this? Was he radicalized in Afghanistan or, here in the United States? And if it makes sense to change some things, I think we need to do that.
Okay, so obviously that is true. Now, this connects with another gigantic story that broke over the course of last week. And that, of course, is a big story from the New York Times about a huge amount of Somali welfare fraud in Minnesota. Now, of course, there have been serious questions to be asked about the widespread fraud and, yes, terrorism connections in the Somali community in Minnesota. I checked with our friends and sponsors over at Comet. That is a project of perplexity about the history of Somali migration into the United States. How many Somali immigrants have entered the U.S. since 1990? Where do they live? According to Perplexity, between 1990 and 2025, the U.S. has seen significant Somali immigration, with estimates suggesting between 140,000 and 167,000 Somali immigrants have settled in the country over this period. Okay, that is up from 2,500 total Somali population in 1990. It has grown due to refugee resettlement and family reunification. Minnesota has the largest Somali community. Ohio and Washington State also have large Somali communities, 21,000 and 15,000 Somali residents, respectively. Well, the New York Times did a bit of journalism, like an actual bit of journalism, when they went ahead and actually reported serious welfare fraud problems in these areas of Minnesota. According to the New York Times, the fraud scandal that rattled Minnesota was staggering in its scale and brazenness. Federal prosecutors charged dozens of people with felonies, accusing them of stealing hundreds of millions of dollars from a government program meant to keep children fed during the COVID-19 pandemic. At first, many in the state saw the case as a one-off abuse during a health emergency, but as new schemes targeting the state's generous safety net programs came to light, state and federal officials began to grapple with a jarring reality. Over the last 5 years, law enforcement officials say, fraud took root in pockets of Minnesota's Somali diaspora as scores of individuals made small fortunes by setting up companies that billed state agencies for millions of dollars worth of social services that were never provided. Federal prosecutors say 59 people have been convicted in these schemes so far, and that more than $1 billion in taxpayers' money has been stolen in 3 plots they are currently investigating. That is more than Minnesota spends annually to run its entire Department of Corrections. Minnesota's fraud scandal stood out even in the context of rampant theft during the pandemic, when Americans stole tens of billions through unemployment benefits, business loans, and other forms of aid, according to federal auditors. Outrage has swelled among Minnesotans. Fraud has turned into a potent political issue in a competitive campaign season. Governor Tim Walz and fellow Democrats are now being asked to explain how so much money was stolen on their watch. President Trump weighed in, calling Minnesota a hub of fraudulent money laundering activity and saying that Somali perpetrators should be sent back to where they came from. So apparently there are about 80,000 people in Minnesota, Somali Americans in Minnesota. And debate over the fraud has opened new rifts between the state's Somali community and other Minnesotans, and has left some Somali Americans saying they're facing a new layer of suspicion against all of them rather than the small group accused of fraud. But of course, the reality is that importing gigantic waves of Somali immigrants into Minnesota, of all places, might create some culture clash, actually. Now, when you read down in the story, one of the things you find, hilariously, is that when allegations were first made about welfare fraud in Minnesota, the first response was, "We can't look into this, it's racist." I know, I can't believe it either. According to the New York Times, the first public sign of a major problem in the state's social services system came in 2022, when federal prosecutors began charging defendants in connection to a program aimed at feeding hungry children. The prosecutors focused on a Minneapolis nonprofit organization called Feeding Our Future, which became a partner to dozens of local businesses that enrolled as feeding sites. State agencies reimbursed the group and its partners for invoices claiming to have fed tens of thousands of kids, but all of it was fake. The meals were non-existent. Business owners instead spent the funds on luxury cars, houses, even real estate projects abroad. Behind the scenes, federal investigators realized that this was not an isolated incident. In one case, hundreds of providers were reimbursed for assistance they claimed to have provided to people at risk for homelessness. But apparently, none of those services were actually provided. The program's annual cost ballooned to more than $104 million last year from a budgeted projection of $2.6 million when it began in 2020. So again, some of this is culture, for sure. Some of this is migration, for sure. And some of this is gigantic sacks of cash, very often tend to be stolen by malign actors. So again, much of this was ignored specifically because of the culture clash issues, because of concerns about racism, concerns about bigotry. When we talk about the Rotherham scandal in the UK and the fact that the authorities literally covered up grooming and raping of children for years, white kids, at the hands of largely Pakistani immigrants. And it was covered up for fear that that story might lend gravitas to anti-immigration folks on Britain's National Party right. When we talk about, understand that same sort of sentiment exists on the left in the United States. According to the New York Times, red flags in the meals program surfaced in the early months of the pandemic. The money kept flowing anyway. In 2020, Minnesota Department of Education officials who administered the program became overwhelmed by the number of applicants seeking to register new feeding sites and began raising questions about the plausibility of some invoices. Feeding Our Future, a nonprofit group that was the largest provider in the pandemic program, responded with a warning. In an email, the group told the state agency failing to promptly approve new applicants from minority-owned businesses would result in a lawsuit featuring accusations of racism that would be sprawled across the news. And then Feeding Our Future sued the agency. So, again, perfectly obvious what was happening here. Kaisa Magan, a Somali American who formerly worked as a fraud investigator for the Minnesota Attorney General's office, said elected officials in the state were reluctant to take more assertive action in response to allegations in the Somali community. Magan said, quote, "There's a perception that forcefully tackling this issue might cause political backlash among the Somali community, which is a core voting bloc for Democrats," saying the quiet part out loud right there. Now, pretty incredible stuff. President Trump responded to this again by doubling down on his suggestion that third world migration be reversed. President Trump actually suggested that Ilhan Omar be thrown out of the United States. She's the representative from this area, of course, over allegations that she married her brother. He said while speaking to reporters on Air Force One, "Somalia, where you have a congressman, goes around telling everybody about our Constitution, but she supposedly came into our country by marrying her brother. If that's true, she shouldn't be a congressperson. We should throw her the hell out of the country." And then he said, "We don't need people coming into the country, quote, telling us what to do." Which again, the president is right. The president also went after the governor of Minnesota, who is presiding over all of this, and called him retarded in the process.
In that same post, you mentioned Tim Walz, and you called him what many Americans do find an offensive word, retarded. Do you stand by that claim of calling Tim Walz retarded?
Yeah, I think there's something wrong with him. Absolutely, sure.
But you don't think that
you have a problem with him? You know what? I think there's something wrong with him. Anybody that would do what he did, anybody that would allow those people into a state and pay billions of dollars out to Somalia. We give billions of dollars to Somalia. It's not even a country because it doesn't function like a country. It's got a name, but it doesn't function like a country. Yeah, there's something wrong with Walz.
I mean, he ain't wrong. And I understand the media are now going to call a ticky-tack foul on President Trump for using the word retarded, which, again, I'm sorry, but has re-entered common parlance. Not to get into a linguistic dispute about the word retarded, but every time in the United States there's an attempt to wipe out of the language some term that people use that is edgy about people who they believe are stupid, it is then replaced by another term. That's just the history of these terms. But Tim Walz is attempting to grasp onto that to avoid the consequences of his own failed governance. Here he was being very offended by the use of the word retarded in relation to him, but apparently not all that offended by, billions of dollars in fraud from the Somali community that votes consistently Democratic.
Donald Trump insulting me is a badge of honor for me, but I think we all know, as both as an educator for a couple decades and as a parent, using that term is just so damaging. It's hurtful. We have fought 3 decades to get this out of our schools. Kids know better than to use it. But look, this is what Donald Trump has done. He's normalized this type of hateful behavior and this type of language.
Okay, I'm sorry. Like, so your defense here is that it's offensive to use the word like, this is not a top 100 priority for Americans. I'm sorry. If you're trying to avoid responsibility for what just happened in your state over the course of years by saying that the president is a bad man for using the word good luck to you on that one. Douglas Murray has a great column over in the New York Post talking about this. He says, you cannot just leave borders open or allow in large numbers of people with totally different value systems from your own. This is the mistake many European countries have committed in recent years. They've opened their homes up to people from almost every part of the world where there is civil strife, war, or just a lower standard of living. The results can be seen everywhere. It's the reason why a country like Sweden, that used to be such a placid, decent place, has become one of the most violent countries in the world, not actually at war. Grenade attacks and gang warfare, these things were recently alien to Sweden, not anymore. It's the same here in the United States. The effects are more dispersed, so the problem can be covered up for longer. But Douglas Murray says all of this begs the question, why should a group of people be given sanctuary in the United States, presumably saying they were fleeing from terror, only to use their time in the United States committing fraud to send to terrorists? How does that make any sense? The president of the United States, of course, is right about this particular issue, and Democrats are freaking out about it, as they should. We'll get to more on this in a moment. First, the Daily Wire shops cyber deals. They are live right now. We're taking up to 70% off conservative gifts for everybody on your list. Gifts like my best-selling book, Lions and Scavengers, Behold Its Beauty. We also have the Golden Leftist Tears tumbler. Extremely limited supply. Check this out. Look at it. It is gold. Behold. I mean, look, it shines in the sunlight. It glimmers with the tears of those you oppose. Extremely limited supply, only back for a limited time. We also have the collected poems of Donald J. Trump. Yes, this is a real thing that we have, and it is actually hysterically funny. Plus, we have hats, T-shirts, hoodies, a whole lot more you can't find anywhere else. Also makes julienne fries. Whether you're shopping for your based uncle, your freedom-loving mom, or just treating yourself for surviving another year of absolute insanity, we've got you covered. Here's the thing. These deals won't last. Neither will the inventory. Items will sell out. So don't be the person scrambling, wondering why everything is already gone. Head on over to dailywire.com/shop right now. That's dailywire.com/shop. Also, it is now Cyber Monday. This is your final shot at the biggest deal we do all year long. Daily Wire Plus annual memberships are 50% off right now. Get every show, every documentary, every movie, our epic new series, The Pendragon Cycle, Rise of the Merlin. All access members get episodes 1 and 2 early on Christmas Day. Everyone else, January 22nd. The deal only happens once a year. Join now at dailywire.com/subscribe. Now, I have to say, there is a clip that is going around of a New York Times contributing op-ed writer named Wajahat Ali. And it is so telling and astonishing. He basically spells out the United States, why the United States failed in allowing mass migration from third world countries. He means this as a sort of brag, I suppose, a sort of audacious statement in the face of Trumpian racism. But what he actually ends up doing is justifying Trump's entire program. Here's what Jahad Ali.
You have lost. You lost. The mistake that you made is you let us in the first place. See, that's the thing with brown people. I'm going to say this as a brown person. There's a lot of us. Like a lot. There's like 1.2 billion in India. There's more than 200 million in Pakistan. There's like 170 million in Bangladesh. Those are just the people there. I'm even talking about the folks who are expats or immigrants. There's a bunch of us. And we breed. We're a breeding people.
Okay. I mean, my goodness. My goodness. And so all of the white supremacists who've been talking about so-called replacement theory, the idea that migrants are going to be brought into the United States to replace the domestically born population, you're just saying the thing they're saying, but in the reverse way. What in the hell? And of course, this speaks to the reality, which is forget about the color of the people coming in, because that is irrelevant to character. The character of the people coming in, the cultures from which they come, the countries from which they come, the concepts and religious beliefs they hold dear. These things, of course, matter to the definition of a country. And when you bring people in en masse, that is going to change the cultural fabric of a country. Duh. That's the whole point, apparently, according to Jahad Ali and people like Jahad Ali. That's incredible. You've lost? What is the thing that they lost? What is the thing they lost? Seriously. Presumably, what he means is you've lost the country. You've lost the country to people like Jahad Ali and their belief systems. I mean, has there ever been a stronger case made for restricting mass migration and reversing much of the migration that's happened into the United States? All of this is coming to a head for a reason. It's coming to a head not just because of isolated incidents like what's happening in Minnesota, which was more systemic than isolated, or what happened in Washington, D.C. with the shooting of the National Guard members. This is happening all over the West because the West, apparently, many in the West have decided to wake up to the fact that they never should have allowed, through their niceness and their kindness, their civilizations to be eaten from within by people who enter and then take advantage of all the benefits on offer, only to fight that civilization and destroy that civilization. And again, I go back to the original point with regard to the shooter in Washington, D.C. That person came to the United States after working with the United States in Afghanistan, apparently, according to what we know. And that person was radicalized in the United States to hate the United States. Something is deeply wrong. There are cancerous centers inside the United States that are spreading nasty and terrible anti-American ideologies and radicalizing people in the United States. So now you have a cancer from without and within. People attempting to enter who have the wrong ideas, who have bad ideas about the world and bad ideas about our civilization, and then come here and take advantage. As I talk about in my book, Lions and Scavengers, the Barbarians. And then you have people who are radicalized by people in the West. These are existential problems for the West. When President Trump talks about ending third world migration and reversing the migration and fighting this growing cancerous problem in the United States, and again, I'm not talking about humans as cancers. I'm talking about ideologies as cancers here. And when you talk about reversing the process that has happened, which is the hollowing out of the American body politic by sectarian groups seeking to destroy Western civilization from within, then when you talk about that, no wonder that is an increasingly popular political program, not only in the United States, but in Europe as well. So meanwhile, Democrats are attempting to spin up allegations that the president of the United States is issuing illegal military orders. So you'll recall that Senator Mark Kelly, along with Senator Alyssa Slotkin from Michigan, and a bunch of other Democrats who had served in the military or in the CIA, that they put out a video calling on members of the military to reject what they called illegal orders. The problem with that argument is that they are going to post facto determine what an illegal order constituted. So that's kind of risky. If you're a member of the military and you follow an order, any order, and then later Democrats get elected to the presidency and determine that the order was in fact illegal, and they move to prosecute you based on following that order, that is a problem. That is why it's kind of dangerous what's happening with these Democrats. So the president of the United States, the DOJ, they've talked about the possibility of court-martialing Mark Kelly because, of course, he's a veteran. And here he was responding.
In my case, Secretary Hegseth said, prosecute him under the Uniform Code of Military Justice for, by the way, reciting the Uniform Code of Military Justice. It's obviously ridiculous. Dana, I'm not backing down. These guys don't scare me. They're not serious people. I mean the President of the United States and the Secretary of Defense. Neither of them.
Meanwhile, Senator Chris Van Hollen, perhaps the dumbest member of the Senate outside of Mazie Hirono of Hawaii, he says that when Democrats say they should disobey orders, members of the military, they're just citing the law of the land.
So we have here 6 real folks who have been dedicated to our country in the military who simply cited the law of the land, which is that our men and women in the military should follow lawful orders, which clearly has become more important than ever right now, now that we have this disclosure about Secretary Hegseth essentially saying kill them all.
Now, the reality is it's going to be very difficult to punish these senators for saying what they are saying because, again, they can hide behind the shield of the sort of rhetoric of the law, which says, of course, no member of the military should obey any legal order. As the Associated Press reports, some say the Pentagon is misreading military law to go after Kelly as a retired Navy fighter pilot. Others say the Arizona Democrat can't be prosecuted as a member of Congress. And then, of course, there are former military prosecutors who say that he didn't do anything wrong. Now, again, there have been courts-martial of retired service members in the past decade. However, this would be pretty unusual, obviously. And again, Kelly is going to claim that he didn't do anything illegal. He just said, don't follow illegal orders. The problem, of course, lies in how do you define an illegal order? And is it, in fact, dangerous for members of the military or past members of the military to go around telling current members of the military, quote unquote, don't follow illegal orders without actually defining what that means? And this issue is coming to a head over alleged war crimes that have been committed by the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth. And so all of this is being fostered by an article in the Washington Post about the destruction of these Venezuelan drug boats. According to the Washington Post, the longer the U.S. surveillance aircraft followed the boat, the more confident intelligence analysts watching from command centers became that the 11 people on board were ferrying drugs. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth gave a spoken directive according to 2 people with direct knowledge of the operation. The order was to kill everybody, one of them said. A missile screamed off the Trinidad coast, striking the vessel and igniting a blaze from bow to stern. For minutes, commanders watched the boat burning on a live drone feed. As the smoke cleared, they got a jolt. 2 survivors were still clinging to the smoldering wreck. The special operations commander overseeing the September 2nd attack ordered a second strike to comply with Hegseth's instructions, according to 2 people familiar with the matter. The 2 men were then blown apart in the water. So, the argument is that the second strike here amounts to a war crime. That once people are in the water, once they've essentially been disabled, that at that point killing them is a war crime. According to the Washington Post, the alleged traffickers pose no imminent threat of attack against the United States and are not, as the Trump administration has tried to argue, in an armed conflict with the United States, according to officials and experts. Because there is no legitimate war between the 2 sides, killing any of the men in the boats amounts to murder, according to Todd Huntley, a former military lawyer who advised special operations forces for 7 years at the height of the U.S. counterterrorism campaigns. There's 2 separate arguments being made. One is you can't blow up the drug boats without authorization from Congress because you're not at war. So if you kill those people, it's happening outside the purview of an authorized action by Congress, and therefore this is illegal. And that's a pretty weak argument considering the use of drone warfare by the Obama administration all over the world, for example. Then there is the secondary issue, which is killing people after the boat has been disabled or destroyed. So Secretary of Defense Hegseth, he put out his own statement, quote, as usual, the fake news is delivering more fabricated, inflammatory, and derogatory reporting to discredit our incredible warriors fighting to protect the homeland. As we said from the beginning and in every statement, these highly effective strikes are specifically intended to be lethal kinetic strikes. The declared intent is to stop lethal drugs, destroy narco boats, and kill the narco terrorists who are poisoning the American people. Every trafficker we kill is affiliated with a designated terrorist organization. The Biden administration preferred the kid gloves approach, allowing millions of people, including dangerous cartels and unvetted Afghans, to flood our communities with drugs and violence. The Trump administration has sealed the border and gone on offense against narco terrorists. Biden coddled terrorists, we kill them. Our current operations in the Caribbean are lawful under both U.S. and international law, with all actions in compliance with the law of armed conflict and approved by the best military and civilian lawyers up and down the chain of command. Our warriors in Southcom put their lives on the line every day to protect the homeland from narco terrorists. I will always have their back. Okay, so you will notice that in that statement, there's nothing that denies the charge that he said kill everybody. So the question becomes, is kill everybody here a war crime? Democrats, of course, are immediately saying that it is, which, by the way, would mean that the officers who carried out the strikes engaged in war crimes, right? This is how it ties into their argument that you can't carry out illegal orders. Because now, presumably, everybody who's in that chain of command who followed the order would be guilty of a war crime and could theoretically go to federal penitentiary. Senator Chris Van Hollen is making that argument. Here he is.
Oh, I think it's very possible there was a war crime committed. Of course, for it to be a war crime, you have to accept the Trump administration's whole construct here.
That we're at war.
Which is we're in armed conflict at war. But even if you accept their legal theory, that it is a war crime. And so I do believe that the Secretary of Defense should be held accountable for giving those kind of orders.
Okay, the problem is once you say that he gave an illegal order, then everybody who carried out the illegal order is also subject to prosecution. And this is a left-wing attempt very often to basically hamstring any military in the performance of its duty. There's always a battle in all kinetic conflicts, always, between the legal side and the people on the ground who actually have to do the fighting, who actually have to do the thing. This is why rules of engagement are really important in war zones. What are our forces allowed to do? What are they not allowed to do? How do you ensure that they don't commit human rights violations while allowing them the ability to protect themselves and protect others and carry out their mission? These are very, very murky boundaries because war is a foggy place for sure. Senator Mark Kelly is also claiming that this is a war crime.
Do you believe if there was a second strike to eliminate any survivors, that constitutes a war crime?
It seems to. If that is true, if what has been reported is accurate, I've got serious concerns about anybody in that chain of command stepping over a line that they should never step over.
Okay, so there actually is an open and interesting debate over whether there was, in fact, some sort of war crime here. According to Andrew McCarthy, who writes for the National Review and who is, of course, a fan of President Trump generally, he says that if all of this happened as described in the Post report, it was at best a war crime under federal law. I say at best because, as regular readers know, I believe these attacks on suspected drug boats without congressional authorization, under circumstances in which the boat operators pose no military threat to the United States, and given that narcotics trafficking is defined in federal law as a crime, not terrorist activity, much less an act of war, are lawless, and therefore the killings are not legitimate under the law of armed conflict. Nevertheless, even if we stipulate, arguendo, that the administration has a colorable claim our forces are in an armed conflict with non-state actors, the laws of war do not permit the killing of combatants who have been rendered hors de combat, meaning out of the fighting, including by shipwreck. So, if the boat gets hit and now the thing's just kind of floundering in the water and there's no threat, you can't just nuke them again. So that's Andrew McCarthy's claim. He says it is not permitted under the laws and customs of honorable warfare to order that no quarter be given to apply lethal force to those who surrender or who are uninjured, shipwrecked, or otherwise unable to fight. Echoing Andrew McCarthy's statements is a group of former U.S. military lawyers, the former JAG Working Group, saying, quote, that they unanimously consider both the giving and execution of these orders to constitute war crimes, murder, or both, right? So that would mean that every member of the military chain of command who is involved in the carrying out of this order would now be subject to criminal penalties. Okay, so the other side is being taken by Professor Brian Cox, who is a professor of law at Cornell. And he says, let's start with the decisive flaw in their statement. Not once does it use or consider the term military objective. He says, if the boat were destroyed, there would be nothing serviceable left of it. But if it's disabled, that is, if the decision maker believed it could still be used to call other narco traffickers to retrieve their cargo, the boat still qualifies as a military objective, and military objectives can be intentionally attacked. So what he's saying is, okay, if the thing is floating and it has a radio and they can call the other narco traffickers to come pick them up as well as the drugs, then the thing is still a threat, and that means you can nuke it. He says, quote, a military objective is any object which, by its nature, location, purpose, or use, make an effective contribution to military action and whose total or partial destruction, capture, or neutralization in the circumstances ruling at the time offers a definite military advantage. So how about a disabled boat? He says if the commander believes it can call for assistance and allow it to continue its mission, it is by definition an object which makes, by its use, an effective contribution. In short, according to the factual scenario reported in the Washington Post story, the boat still qualified as a military objective after the initial attack, and therefore the second strike was not a war crime. So, again, the basic idea is that while these people may have been, on a boat that was blown up, the boat wasn't totally blown up, it was disabled, it wasn't destroyed, and therefore it still could have been used as a military objective or for a military objective by the narco-terrorists. He says that If they were shipwrecked, then they were out of combat. But again, if they are not shipwrecked, meaning that, again, they can call for help and then they can get back in the battle, then you can presumably still hit them. So this is going to be an open legal debate. And again, these debates, I don't want to pretend that these debates aren't serious or that we shouldn't be having debates over this. We certainly should. But we are now in, shall we say, dangerous territory, ideologically and legally. The reason being, if you're a soldier and you receive an order from a member of the chain of command, and that order lives where such orders usually live, in the murky area that is war, and in the murky area that is war, you are afraid that a Democrat is elected president in 3 years and you find yourself on the wrong end of a prosecution, basically what you're going to end up with very often is a version of what we had in policing called the Ferguson effect, where cops decided they were simply going to stop enforcing the law because they were so terrified that if they did, they would end up prosecuted. And you can't have that for a successful military. You just can't. That's why it's quite dangerous what Democrats have been doing, talking about illegal orders and not illegal orders. If they can name an illegal order that should not have been followed, then they presumably should go ahead and do something about it with the full investigative power of Article 1 of the Constitution. If not, then these sort of broad statements not only are not helpful, they do a disservice to members of the military who have to make the hard calls as to what to do every single day with deadly force. Okay, meanwhile, all the targeting of the narco-terrorists in the Caribbean, all of that has to do with an attempt to box in Venezuela. So the Trump administration is clearly now making an attempt to pressure the Venezuelan regime into folding. That is what is happening here. Over the weekend, President Trump apparently told Venezuelan dictator Nicolas Maduro, that he should leave. According to the New York Post, Trump gave Maduro a strongly worded ultimatum as tensions flared with the South American nation, telling him to resign and leave or else, according to a bombshell report. According to the Miami Herald, during a call between Trump and Maduro, the socialist president demanded that he be allowed to maintain control of Venezuela's military if he paved the way for free elections there. He also reportedly sought global amnesty for all of his alleged crimes. Trump's refusal on both counts was said to be swift as he followed up with an offer that Maduro may not be able to refuse, leave now or else. The question is what the or else looks like at this point. U.S. Senator Dave McCormick told Fox News Sunday, "We have a war that's coming through fentanyl, through opioids, through cocaine. It killed 100,000 Americans last year. That's twice the number of people that died in 8 years of Vietnam, 4,000 Pennsylvanians." The president then announced he was closing the airspace around the South American country. The USS Gerald F. Ford, which is America's biggest warship, and a Marine Expeditionary Unit capable of amphibious invasion are floating offshore as well. And he warned that military operations inside Venezuela could begin very, very soon. Unclear what those would target or how the targeting would happen. Now, how exactly that no-fly decree is going to be enforced, that is an open question. We do have F-35s that are there. We don't have international authority to really be over Venezuelan airspace. However, it is also clear that everyone is being very, very careful. Venezuela has revoked, apparently, operating rights to Iberia, TAP, Avianca, LATAM, Colombia, Turkish Airlines, and GOL. So they're basically now locked down. They're in a state of complete lockdown. Maduro and his allies are saying this is American colonial aggression, saying the United States wants to seize the country's vast oil reserves, which of course is untrue. It is Venezuela's nationalization of oil resources that has led to the complete impoverishment of the country in the first place. So clearly the Trump administration would love to see the Maduro regime fall. Ordinary Venezuelans are preparing for the possibility that there will be some sort of kinetic action inside Venezuela, not just off the coast. According to the Washington Post, U.S. fighter jets escorted a strategic bomber near the coast one day this week. State-controlled media showed video of Venezuelan soldiers firing into the sky, which, again, that is always the mark of a strong military power, is firing rifles at F-35s and such. A supermarket in East Caracas filled with people raiding the shelves to lay in supplies. The next day, the sky was quiet. The capital returned to normal. People don't know exactly what to expect at this point. Maduro has mobilized his troops. He's called on citizens to join militias to defend the country. Now, where things go from here? Open question for sure. Given the fact that Maduro, apparently, his jet has now flown to Brazil. That is according to the Express. So, things are getting spicy. President Trump issued a statement over the weekend to all airlines pilots, drug dealers, and human traffickers. Please consider the airspace above and surrounding Venezuela to be closed in its entirety. Thank you for your attention to this matter. President Donald J. Trump. And again, the presidential jet in Venezuela, that's Maduro, who's the dictator, flew from Caracas to the border of Brazil. So it hasn't actually entered Brazil. Lula, of course, is friendly with Maduro because Lula is a horrible leader. Now, what should the United States do? What are the options here? So pretty clearly, the United States is playing chicken with Maduro at this point, ratcheting up the tensions, closing the borders, fostering the possibility of military action in order for there to be a true change in regime. It's not going to be enough for people to get out in the streets. We've already seen that. We already saw years ago when Juan Guaido was elected in an actual election. So Juan Guaido was probably elected in 2018. There were disputed elections. Guaido was leader of the opposition, and that led to a crisis that lasted for approximately 3 years over Maduro retaining power, despite the fact that he almost certainly was not the person who won the election or was wanted by the people of Venezuela. But it turned out that getting people out in the streets between 2019 and 2021 didn't actually do much. That in the end, Maduro just consolidated his control. And so the question now is whether there is something more. So the fact that the United States is blowing up a source of revenue, those narco trafficking boats, that the United States is closing the airspace, that the United States is doing all these things, ratchets up the pressure. You have to imagine the only reason the United States would be doing this is if they have actual allies they can work with inside the business elite or the political elite or certainly the military elite inside Venezuela. Because the mark of regimes that tend to be able to withstand Western pressure are ones that have a very solid chain of command in the pay of the dictator. That is true in places like Russia. It's true in Iran. It's true in North Korea. The question is whether it's true in Venezuela. Because if you look at the history of coups in Latin and South America, if you look at the history of regime changes or dictators who are removed, what you will see is a few factors in common. Usually, there is a split or a defection inside the security forces surrounding the president or the dictator. That the president or dictator relies on the ability in the end to point guns at the people and tell them to stand down. And if there is a break, then the regime tends to fall. Usually, you have to have somebody, a regime elite, right? Somebody second, third, fourth in command who's willing to take the lead in the opposition, which of course is risky because if you lose, you die, typically. And then international pressure and economic crisis points can create the impetus for the overthrow of a regime. So you have to imagine that the only reason the Trump administration would be pursuing this is if they have some sort of serious intel that there is, in fact, a break inside Maduro's security organization. That there is somebody who's willing to take up the baton and that additional pressure forces Maduro to flee and the military to make a move to defenestrate him, replace him with a transitional figure, or to hold free and fair elections. Again, there's a long history of this in South America, Paraguay in 1989 or Panama in 1989, Haiti in 1986, Bolivia in 2019. This sort of stuff is not infrequent in Latin and South America, but those preconditions better be there. And I will say that the Trump administration is up the ante so much that if Trump backs down at this point, it's going to look pretty bad for the United States. Okay, meanwhile, negotiations continue over Ukraine. One of the theories is that what's going on in Venezuela is connected with what's going on over in Ukraine in a couple of ways. One is the idea that the United States is, in sort of soft fashion, acknowledging a Russian sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, while simultaneously solidifying its own sphere of influence in South and Latin America, and even a Chinese sphere of influence in the Far East. That is the most cynical and negative view of what's going on. Another view is that by freeing up the Venezuelan oil supply, and Maduro goes down, suddenly the oil supply from Venezuela kicks back up again, and the United States is no longer as dependent on Russian oil or can facilitate the flow of Venezuelan oil over to Europe so that Europe is less reliant on Russian oil, which would be a good thing. The United States has been making a very hard push to get to the end of the Ukraine war, largely by putting serious pressure on Ukraine. There have been no indicators that I have seen thus far that the Russians are willing to make any sort of deal that is doable for the Ukrainians at this point. Nonetheless, there were meetings in Florida between U.S. and Ukrainian officials, 4 hours of talks. According to NPR, Secretary of State Marco Rubio told reporters afterward the session was productive, but that work remains in search of a peace deal. Here's what Secretary Rubio had to say.
So this is not just about ending a war. This is about ending a war in a way that creates a mechanism and a way forward that will allow them to be independent and sovereign, never have another war again, and create tremendous prosperity for its people.
So the question is whether that is true or not, meaning the original plan that was proposed by Steve Witkoff last week was a bleep show. It was a plan that basically was a list of Russian demands. And the Ukrainians were very upset with it. And now it seems that Rubio had to step in, and so did Jared, in order to push back against what was a bad plan and come to something that appeared to be in the middle. Rustem Umerov is head of Ukraine's Security Council, and he responded to Rubio by expressing his country's appreciation for U.S. efforts. He said, U.S. is hearing us, U.S. is supporting us, U.S. is working beside us. Unclear what progress has been made in the talks. Now, again, all of this is happening at the same time that there is serious pressure on the Ukrainian government to make changes at the top. A person named Andrei Yermak, who is the top aide to Vladimir Zelensky and one of the key peace negotiators, he apparently has now resigned after anti-corruption agencies raided his home. I mean, it is well known, by the way, that the Ukrainian government is rife with corruption. This has been true for legitimately decades. Not a shock at all. The top members of the Ukrainian government may have been war profiteering off of this war. That would not be surprising at all. Zelensky said, I want no one to have any questions about Ukraine. Today, we have the following internal decisions. There will be a reboot of the office of the president of Ukraine. The head of the office, Andrei Yermak, has written a letter of resignation. Apparently, he said that he was cooperating with the authorities. Now, let's just be clear. Corruption in Ukraine does not mean siding with Russia. Corruption in Ukraine, if the United States uses the excuse of corruption in Ukraine to side with one of the world's most corrupt and evil regimes in the Russian regime, that would be a giant failure. We work with corrupt and terrible regimes all over the world against people who are even worse than they are. The Saudi regime is not famous for its non-corruption or non-violence. The United States must work with the Saudi regime in order to hem in, for example, the threat of Muslim Brotherhood takeovers or against the Iranians. That's just the way international politics works. It's a series of terrible choices. With that said, the Ukrainians, of course, are still very concerned that the United States may put too much pressure on Ukraine and not enough on Russia. Here is the former Ukrainian foreign minister, Dmytro Kuleba, talking about the U.S. peace plan.
I don't think it's a revelation to anyone that just copy-pasting Russian ultimatums, as it was done once again, clearly tells you where all this comes from. You know, if it looks like a duck and walks like a duck, it's probably a duck. So if it looks like a Russian ultimatum, then probably it comes from Russia.
Okay, so, again, we will see whether that is the case and what is pushed forward here. A bad deal that leads to a further war between Ukraine and Russia 2 years from now is not a win for the United States, nor is any sort of cap on the Ukrainian military forces. I haven't seen what sort of pressure is being applied on the Russians thus far to get them to the table, because all I've seen is the Ukrainians giving and giving and giving, and the Russians not giving a single inch. The Ukrainians have been saying they're willing to do a ceasefire since February. The Russians have not ceasefire for a single second. So at some point, we're going to have to ask a pretty simple question. What is Vladimir Putin willing to do? Alrighty. As we continue here on the show for our members, we'll get into the question of when Social Security is going to go bankrupt. Because remember, we as a country are still running a gigantic debt. And the big drivers of our debt are those social welfare programs. Remember, in order to watch, you have to be a member. If you're not a member, become a member. Use code Shapiro at checkout for 2 months free on all annual plans. Click that link in the description and join us. The Trump DOJ seems to be targeting Fed Chair Jerome Powell. What's going on with that? Plus, we're joined by a Vice Admiral to talk about the latest in Iran and a spokesperson for the Department of Homeland Security to explain what ICE is doing in Minnesota. First, why do people just like you become Daily Wire Plus members? Because when riots break out in Minneapolis, we send reporters into the chaos. For investigative journalism that goes where others will not. For premium entertainment that actually means something. Like Real History with Matt Walsh premiering Monday, January 19th. And for the biggest swing we've ever taken, a full-scale cinematic epic, the Pendragon cycle Rise of the Merlin premiering January 22nd. People join because this isn't just a subscription, it's a community. People watching together, reading together, laughing, debating, pushing back, refusing to shut up or sit down. Go to dailywireplus.com and join right now. Well, everyone in the world of economics and in the markets is talking about President Trump's DOJ going after Jerome Powell, the Federal Reserve Chairman. Now, again, Jerome Powell is leaving the Fed chairmanship next year anyway. And not only that, he is leaving the Federal Reserve entirely in January of 2028. So it's somewhat confusing as to why the DOJ is going after Jerome Powell if all they have on him is that there are cost overruns in the rebuilding and reconstruction of the Federal Reserve building. Nonetheless, the controversy is hot and heavy today. According to the Wall Street Journal, for years, Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell responded to President Trump's broadsides in ways that generally avoided escalation. That changed on Sunday night. In an extraordinary 2-minute video message, Powell accused the administration of using the threat of criminal prosecution to pressure the Fed into lowering rates. He framed the Justice Department investigation as nothing less than a head-on challenge to the Fed's ability to operate free of political control. And of course, he is not the first Federal Reserve Board member to be targeted by the DOJ. Lisa Cook has also been targeted by the DOJ over supposedly misfiling her mortgage forms, falsifying that it was a second mortgage when it was actually a first mortgage, or whatever the case is. The point that Powell is making is that it's kind of weird that the only people who seem to be cropping up in the DOJ list of people to investigate are people who are opposed to President Trump's agenda, which is lowering those interest rates. Now, as I've said before, artificially low interest rates are not a good thing. I understand that we've lived with those for a very long time in the United States. It's why everybody has a 3.5% mortgage. But the reality is that the interest rate, if it were allowed to free flow, if it were allowed to float where it should be, would actually ensure less uncreditworthiness in the market. It would prevent speculation. It would allow the market to naturally follow its ebbs and flows rather than creating these gigantic bubbles, which then pop. And a lower interest rate set by the Federal Reserve right now, which effectively injects money into the supply, creates more speculative bubbles. Right now, we may already be in a speculative bubble with regard to AI, which we'll get to in a little while. And so lowering those interest rates as a matter of policy, I'm not sure it's so wise. But even if you were to think that the interest rates should be lowered, the reality is that political pressure on the Federal Reserve to lower the interest rates is going to create enormous schisms in the economy. It's going to make people feel as though the central bank of the United States is operating with political motives in mind, purely political motives in mind, and that the interest rates actually are artificially low, not because the Federal Reserve is getting it wrong, but because of political pressure. And once that happens, once monetary policy becomes a pure tool of whichever party is in power, you start to have a real problem because you can deflate your way out of problems, inflate your way into problems. And there are downstream effects to all of this for the American people. This, by the way, is why I am a devotee of the Austrian School of Economics, which suggests a modified gold standard, not the Federal Reserve sitting there and either printing dollars or buying bonds off the market or injecting liquidity into the system by offering lower interest rates in the overnight markets. Apparently, subpoenas arrived late on Friday. Powell, a lawyer by training, spent the weekend huddling with his advisors, weighing how to respond. A criminal investigation of a sitting chair is without precedent. Powell's message was, too, according to the Wall Street Journal. By going public, Powell was making sure that pressure applied in private couldn't stay private. The decision to disclose the investigation appeared to reflect a belief that the public should know what was unfolding. The threat of prosecution of a sitting Fed chair would be material information for investors or anyone else trying to understand the forces shaping interest rate deliberations. Now, President Trump is claiming he didn't know about the DOJ subpoenas and that any criminal investigation would not be related to disagreements that the White House actually had with Powell over the interest rates. And a lot of allies of the president are not particularly happy about all of this. They see this as needlessly chaotic. According to Politico, a growing number of Republicans on Capitol Hill are expressing unease with the DOJ's move to investigate Jerome Powell. According to House Financial Services Chair French Hill of Arkansas, he said that this creates an unnecessary distraction that could undermine this and future administration's ability to make sound monetary policy decisions. Quote, I've known Chairman Powell since we worked together at Treasury during the George H.W. Bush administration. Then as now, I know Mr. Powell to be a man of integrity with a strong commitment to public service. While over the years we've had our policy disagreements, I found him to be forthright, candid, and a person of the highest integrity. Senator Kevin Cramer, Republican of North Dakota, called Powell a bad Fed chair who has been elusive with Congress, especially regarding the overruns of the elaborate renovations of the building. I do not believe, however, he is a criminal. Again, Cramer is a strong ally of President Trump. He said, I hope this criminal investigation can be put to rest quickly along with the remainder of Jerome Powell's term. We need to restore confidence in the Fed. Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, who, again, is a sort of purpley senator. She tends to vote more often with the Democrats. She wrote that the administration's investigation is nothing more than an attempt at coercion and added, if the DOJ believes an investigation into Chair Powell is warranted based on project cost overruns, which aren't unusual, then Congress needs to investigate the DOJ. The stakes are too high to look the other way. If the Federal Reserve loses its independence, the stability of our markets and the broader economy will suffer. And again, this sort of stuff is not salutary for Republican chances in the midterms. It isn't. What Americans are looking for right now is a feeling of solidity. They want to feel as though things are moving in the right direction, that they are not standing on shifting sands all the time. And what the polling shows right now is that people are increasingly not just moving away from Republicans, they're moving away from both parties, actually. Brand new Gallup polling shows 45% of Americans, the highest in recorded history, now identify as political independents. Now, that doesn't mean they're not voting Republican or Democrat. It means they do not identify with either party as sort of a point of pride. In most years since Gallup began recording these statistics, since 1988, independents have been the largest political group. But that percentage has been skyrocketing since about 2005. In 2005, the American public was split 33, essentially. Today, almost half say they're political independents at this point. And again, if you look at how people are identifying by cohort, what you see is that Gen Zers are identifying as independent overwhelmingly at 56%, Democrat 27%, Republican 17%. Millennials are identifying as independent 54%, 24% Democrat, 21% Republican. Gen X identifies 31% Republican, 42% independent, 25% Democrat. And it's really only as people get older that they stop identifying nearly as much as independent. When it comes to how they are leaning, Republican independent leaners, about 15% of the population, but Democrat leaning independents represent 20%. So again, if you add up the Democratic identifiers with the Democratic leaning independents, they are currently at 47% of the electorate. For Republicans, that statistic is 42%. So again, the numbers are not looking amazing for Republicans here. With that said, when it comes to identifying ideologically, a plurality of Americans say they identify as conservative, followed by 33% of moderate. There is a rising percentage, 28% identify as liberal or very liberal. So if there is movement, that movement is actually in the direction of liberal to very liberal at this point. More on this in a moment. First, this episode is sponsored by our friends over at Pure Talk. If your credit card balance is stressing you out after all the holiday spending, I've got something that can save you money right now. You can cut your cell phone bill in half by switching on over to Pure Talk's Saver Plan. Just $20 a month for unlimited talk, text, and 3 gigs of high-speed data on Pure Talk's super-fast nationwide 5G network. And as a veteran-led company that actually cares about giving back to those who serve, if you're active or former military or a first responder, you'll save an additional 20% every single month. The easiest way to free up cash flow is to reduce your monthly recurring bills. Start with cutting overpriced wireless and switching to my wireless company. I've been using Pure Talk myself for years. Great tower network, best price. What do you have to lose? Go check them out right now at puretalk.com/Shapiro. Make the switch today in as little as 10 minutes. Again, talk, text, and data for just $20 a month. That's puretalk.com/Shapiro. You'll save an additional 50% off your very first month of coverage. Pure Talk is America's wireless company. Again, puretalk.com/Shapiro to save an additional 50% off your first month of coverage. Also, I've been spending a lot of time with family over the holidays. It's been wonderful, but it also makes you think of, the importance of making sure that, God forbid, something happens to you, they're taken care of. And this is why you need life insurance. Listen, it can feel overwhelming to even know where to start when you're searching for a good life insurance program. Well, this is where our sponsor, Policy Genius, comes in. It's an online marketplace where you can compare quotes from top insurers side by side, completely free. No jumping around between websites, no endless phone calls. What really stands out is their team actually works for you. They're licensed agents who help you figure out what you actually need, not what some company wants to sell you. They walk you through coverage amounts, prices, all of it. No guesswork, just straight answers. They handle the paperwork, answer your questions, and honestly, just take that weight off your shoulders. You get clarity on what you need and can move forward fast. It's the perfect time to lock this in. Start 2026 with real peace of mind. Check out Policy Genius. They've got thousands of 5-star reviews from people who finally found that right policy for their needs. You'll thank yourself later. With Policy Genius, real users have gotten 20-year, $2 million policies for just $53 a month. Ease the weight of protecting a wonderful life. Head on over to policygenius.com/Shapiro to compare life insurance quotes from top companies. See how much you could save. That's policygenius.com/Shapiro. So Republicans are running in choppy waters for sure. And the president injecting, I would say, needless chaos into the economic system is not a great idea, particularly because, again, there are a lot of indicators that things are going pretty well. CNN reported, for example, that the mortgage rates have now dropped below 6%. Again, that's not 3.5%, but it's certainly well below the 8 or 9% that seemed to be the rule of the day during the Biden administration.
Mortgage rates on Friday fell below 6% for the first time in years. And this comes after the president ordered his quote unquote representatives to begin buying $200 billion worth of mortgage bonds. What are you hearing about this move?
So at first, we actually did see yields coming down, and that's exactly what the administration wanted. And it was interesting because the bond market sort of waited a bit to suss out how they felt about this. And then you had investors coming in and saying, okay, let's move rates down. But then after this Powell investigation dropped over the weekend, we have the exact opposite effect happening. The market has already undone all of the good of lower rates that happened off the back of that $200 billion mortgage bond purchase announcement.
Now, with that said, again, mortgage rates being lower is a good thing. It means that people can get a mortgage more easily. Meanwhile, it turns out that, as we've been noting, there's been a lot of talk about affordability. And one of the things that I have been pushing for a while, and that, of course, has now been taken out of context repeatedly, is the idea that rents are not the same everywhere. Rents are not the same in Manhattan as they are in Austin, Texas. And it seems that actually a bunch of the Sunbelt cities, the rents have not only been coming down, even with regard to, say, luxury apartments, rents have been coming down and concessions have been going up. According to the Wall Street Journal, about 54% of rentals in the Phoenix metro area are giving tenants at least 1 month off their rent. Why? Well, because builders saw that there was a movement in population into Phoenix, and those evil, terrible corporations then built a bunch of luxury apartments, and then fewer people than expected showed up, and then the rents went down. See how that works? When you increase the supply and the demand stabilizes, then the price goes down. I know, shocking. The renter-friendly environment in Phoenix is a symptom of the city's enormous glut of high-end apartments. Developers flooded the Sunbelt with new luxury buildings and flashy amenities during the pandemic years when droves of remote workers were moving in. That led to a record surge of new apartments hitting the market. Now there aren't enough renters to fill them. Places like Denver and Charlotte, North Carolina are similarly oversupplied. By the way, you will notice that some of those places, like Charlotte particularly, are actually heavily corporate owned. We were told that those corporations owning apartment buildings was bad, but the rents are going down. There's not a correlation between corporate ownership and rents going up. It all depends on the amount of supply injected into the system, particularly if people in corporations, for example, are buying up houses that were owned by others and then renting them out. That now is a piece of rental supply. Landlords struggling to fill their empty apartments use concessions as a way to draw more tenants without having to cut their baseline prices. The renters effectively end up paying a lower rent. Landlords prefer that upfront discount because it's a more temporary hit and allows them to maintain the advertised value of the property for lenders and investors. But Phoenix rents have been falling steadily. And again, it is not just Phoenix. The other cities that are offering major concessions, exactly where you would think: Phoenix, Denver, Charlotte, Austin, San Antonio, Raleigh, North Carolina, Jacksonville, Florida, Tampa, Florida, Nashville, and Las Vegas. You notice where you're not seeing a lot of that stuff? LA, New York, precisely the places where we are told that nobody should ever move. You should stay there, and rent control will fix the problem for you. So again, there are good indicators here that people are going to be able to achieve more affordable lifestyles, particularly if they are living in red areas in red states. Meanwhile, Kevin Hassett, chairman of the National Council of Economic Advisors, he says that we are looking at possibly 5% GDP growth in Q4, which is astonishing.
Bottom line right now, I'm looking at the output numbers, and we got GDP now north of 5% in the fourth quarter after 4% the previous quarter. So I think you got to say that Trump policies are really working. They're really working, and they're working because they're onshoring production, they're causing factories to build, and in the fullest of time, I expect that to cause a job blowout in the second half of next year, especially.
Now, again, I do not think that the reason that the Trump economy is working is because of, say, the tariffs. I think the Trump economy is working because we maintain the same tax rates. We did not upset the apple cart. We've cut regulations in a pretty marked way. And again, populations are moving from non-business friendly areas like California to significantly more business friendly areas like, say, Texas and Florida. Meanwhile, the home building costs are going to come down. They will. This is a point being made by former Senator Kristen Sinema. She was a Democrat who turned independent. She points out that as AI kicks in, as robotics kicks in, the cost on building a home is going to drop pretty markedly, which of course is true.
So there are about 8 or so companies in the country that are using AI robots to build homes. You're going to see those start deploying out this year. We're reducing the cost of home building by up to 40%. Wow. That's going to make a huge difference for middle-class Americans.
Part of this is part of a bigger story, which is that the middle class has been moving into the upper middle class for years on end. This, of course, is a point being made by the Wall Street Journal editorial board, and this has been true for a long time. According to Stephen Rose and Scott Winship, most studies purporting to find a shrinking middle class in America are prone to a variety of measurement and analytical problems. The biggest is the difficulty of defining middle class. Instead, Rose and Winship set an absolute marker for different income groups based on multiples of the federal poverty level in 2024. So, for example, for families of 3, poor is a household income below 40 grand. The core middle class would be incomes from 67 grand to 133 grand. Upper middle class would be incomes up to 400 grand. Then they use that inflation data to calibrate those thresholds for previous years going back to 1979. Measured in that way, the story of the past 50 years is steady progress out of the core middle class and into the upper middle class. The share of families in that core middle class has declined to 30.8% in 2024 from 35.5% in 1979. But so have the proportions in the poor and lower middle class cohorts. The upper middle class has exploded. Only 10.4% of people in 1979 were in the upper middle class. Now, that is nearly 1/3 of families. For the first time in American history, according to Rose and Winship, more families in 2024 were above the core middle class threshold, 35%, than below it. Now, again, that doesn't mean we don't have cost overruns and cost problems, particularly in heavily regulated blue areas. But the notion that the American economy has been failing everybody is clearly untrue on a fundamental level. Meanwhile, we are seeing some consolidation in the AI industry. This is kind of interesting because you could see a world where this does lead to the bubble bursting, as we were discussing a little bit earlier. Well, we are also seeing a consolidation inside the AI industry. So a fascinating story out today. Apparently, Apple has now chosen Google's Gemini to power Siri. So that'll make Siri a hell of a lot better. It also means that Gemini now has a leg up. Gemini is incredible. It's in heavy competition with ChatGPT right now as the best AI chatbot that is available today, the best LLM available today. Gemini seems to be growing by leaps and bounds. Well, if, let's say, Gemini were to outcompete OpenAI so thoroughly that OpenAI were to start to fall apart, that could have some knock-on effects to the broader economy. Doesn't mean that AI is a bubble. Does mean that there are certain competitors who could theoretically lose. When competitors lose and there's a consolidation in the market, depends if there's bleed over to other companies as well. So we'll definitely be keeping an eye on that. Meanwhile, the other big story of the day, of course, is the continuation of chaos surrounding what's going on with ICE. Obviously, the anger is palpable in places like Minneapolis. People don't believe they're breaking the law even when they're breaking the law. If you get in the way of ICE officials who are attempting to pursue a federal operation, you are, in fact, violating federal law, and you will get yourself into hot water. According to the Washington Post, they say they're monitoring ICE arrests. Feds say they are breaking the law. They're talking here about a lot of these sort of ICE watch groups. The fatal shooting of Renee Good last week, says the Washington Post, as ICE officers and residents faced off on a residential street here, has brought new attention to these sorts of activities. Federal court rulings say citizens can observe and record police activity in public areas as part of their First Amendment rights. Many of the observers are doing nothing more than that. But as officers and agents employ aggressive tactics, some activists have blown whistles to warn community members of approaching law enforcement, tried to follow immigration enforcement vehicles, or use their own cars to block the roadways. That enters murkier legal territory. Some legal experts said such behavior could, in theory, justify obstruction of justice charges. Well, that's particularly true if you're taking your car and literally blocking ICE agents from getting to the place they need to be. Officials throughout the Department of Homeland Security are vowing to prosecute anybody who interferes with an operation or endangers an officer. Joining us on the line to discuss is Tricia McLaughlin. She's Assistant Secretary for Public Affairs for Homeland Security. Thanks so much for taking the time. Really appreciate it.
Ben, thank you for having me.
So first of all, why don't you explain, for people who've only been watching the legacy media coverage, why don't you explain exactly what the Department of Homeland Security is doing with these sort of large-scale ICE deportation operations? Who are they targeting? Which are the people that they're going after?
We are targeting the worst criminal illegal aliens. Ben, we know at least 20 million criminal illegal aliens came into this country over the last 4 years alone. So really, our top priority are these gang members, our murderers, our child. I just see the reports every single day. They come into piece of paper on my office. And what we've seen is just flabbergasting as far as the number of criminals who have been allowed to walk around with impunity in this country. There's been over 1,000 known or suspected terrorists that we've arrested in the last year, 3,500 members of Tren de Aragua that we've arrested. And there's plenty more who are out there. And that's why we have been flooding the zone to get these individuals out of our country.
So how necessary is it to, quote unquote, flood the zone? So obviously the ICE operation has been incredibly visible. That means that you have groups that are well-funded, like ICE Watch, for example, who are showing up to obstruct ICE operations. I think that formerly the ineffective operations pursued by non-Trump administrations during my lifetime have been kind of low visibility operations by ICE. Certainly what we're watching now is significantly more visible. Is it necessary for ICE to be as visible as they're being in pursuing these operations?
Well, I think we should take a step back and talk about what does a sanctuary city mean. So we're talking about Minneapolis, New York City, Los Angeles, Chicago, and we call them sanctuary cities. What exactly does that mean? A, it means that these sanctuary city politicians are harboring these criminal illegal aliens. But B, it also means that our law enforcement is not permitted to work with them. And C, and this is the most important part, I think, for your audience, is that means ICE law enforcement is not allowed into the jails. So if Chicago picks up a criminal illegal alien, maybe they picked up somebody who was convicted of, and that person is in their jail, they're not allowed to release them to ICE or coordinate their eventual release to ICE for eventual deportation. What happens is that person will serve a certain amount of time and then they'll be released back onto the streets. So the reason that we have such a large law enforcement presence is because we can't go into those jails to target those criminals. And so we have to really sweep the city and target them and place using intelligence, using our case analysis, and make sure that we're going after these individuals.
So when we look at the sort of thing that's been happening in Minnesota, where you have people suggesting that ICE is engaged in state-sponsored terrorism or that ICE is the Gestapo, what was the exact operation that was happening in Minnesota for people unfamiliar?
So we've arrested in just the last 5 weeks alone 2,000 illegal aliens. That includes multiple, I would say scores, in fact, multiple murders, a known and suspected terrorists, multiple gang members. But we also, in Minneapolis itself, of course, we've seen a scourge of fraud, $9 billion, but we think that that's just the tip of the iceberg. So our Homeland Security investigators are on the ground there. We've had about 300. They're not doing immigration enforcement. They're really looking at this fraud and white collar crime. In addition, we have about 1,000 plus ERO, which is ICE enforcement, those members on the ground who are really sweeping the city there. And as well, we are also doing immigration fraud, high-level investigations with USCIS, which is the arm of DHS that gives out visas, gives out green cards, but also does audits for fraud, like we're seeing in Minneapolis.
So obviously enormous eyeballs on this Renee Good situation, which I think everyone can agree, regardless of your interpretation of the situation, is tragic, but that has nothing to do with whether the officer who was involved did anything wrong. The only question from a legal perspective with regard to the officer is whether he had the objectively reasonable view that he was about to be hit by a car. And since he, in fact, was hit by a car in the process of shooting the person who was killed, that seems to be dispositive from a purely legal level. Why do you think this is blown up this way?
Well, I think that everyone's going into their different camps, and instead of waiting and looking at the true facts on the ground, of course, immigration enforcement is polarizing, particularly to those on the left. But the truth of the matter is, this was the mandate that President Trump was given when he was elected into office. The American people saw that crime was surging. If you look at Minneapolis alone, since Governor Walz became governor, homicides in Minneapolis have increased 50%. But I think when you look at this particular incident, of course, any loss of life is tragic, and we pray for the deceased and her family. But what happened leading up to this, those facts are incredibly important. At 10:25 a.m. Central Time on Wednesday, January 7th, what happened was this individual, she had been impeding and blocking in our ICE law enforcement officers. She had been doing that throughout the day, obstructing lawful operations, which, Ben, as you know, that is a felony. At one point, our ICE law enforcement officers then approached her vehicle and said to get out of the car. She was going to be under arrest, and they commanded her to stop obstructing operations. That's when she would not obey those lawful commands. That's when we see in the video, the law enforcement officer is in front of her. She hits the gas, and he was in fear of his own life, and he was in fear of the law enforcement who were around him. She weaponized her vehicle. She used it as a deadly weapon, and our officer, he responded as his training instructs him to do. And unfortunately, there was a loss of life here, but our officer, he conducted himself in the way he should have, and he did save his own life.
So what do you make of, again, major Democrats who are coming out and comparing ICE to the Gestapo, suggesting that we are living now under the predations of police state and vowing that they're going to try to impede ICE operations themselves. You've seen those sorts of claims being made by top-level Democratic politicians.
Well, they're clearly legally illiterate because ICE, CBP, and other DHS law enforcement, they are conducting these operations with the law behind them. If people don't like ICE enforcing the rule of law, which is what our men and women are doing every single day, these politicians should change the law, or they can lobby Congress to change the law. But continuing to demonize and vilify our law enforcement, you're going to see more incidents like this because people who are either brainwashed or lunatics are going to take matters into their own hands. We've already seen these vehicles be routinely and perpetually weaponized against our law enforcement. We have a 1,000% increase in assaults against law enforcement. I mean, Ben, just last week alone, we had 10 of these vehicle rammings. These vehicles are deadly weapons, and one of our law enforcement officers could easily end up killed if we don't see a stop to this. But I think as far as the political nature of this for the Democrats as well, obviously, Minneapolis has been a flashpoint because of the massive amount of fraud that we've seen and that Homeland Security investigations are investigating. And so I think that there's a part of this where they're trying to circle the wagons and really use this as a smokescreen so people stop talking about the fraud.
And Tricia, one of the things that really is sort of unnoted in all of this is the fact that the number of deportations from red states actually, in many cases, outnumbers the number of deportations from blue states. The difference is that the blue state governors are trying to obstruct and sanctuary city mayors are trying to obstruct in these blue areas. In red states, if they cooperate with ICE, then these operations tend to go off pretty easily without a hitch. And then the deportations are actually pretty sizable. So it is not as though the Trump administration is only targeting blue areas of blue states. A huge number of deportations are happening in red states and red areas.
No, completely. I mean, you look at Louisiana, we have a large-scale operation in New Orleans where we have a governor who's cooperating with us. We have law enforcement who's cooperating with us. That makes it a lot safer, not just for our law enforcement, but for the public on the ground as well. Because when we start to have agitators, we start to have rioters, people who are impeding operations or assaulting law enforcement, our law enforcement are able to call local and state officials for backup. And that really makes sure that there aren't these dangerous situations that spin out of control. But you'll also, a lot of your viewers will have seen in the news that we have surged CBP law enforcement on the ground there to Minneapolis. A lot of that is so that we can make sure that we are quelling any violence that we see from these violent agitators. We're seeing things get more and more coordinated, more and more people coming on the ground and using tactics like vehicle rammings and assault against law enforcement. So we still need to conduct operations in Minneapolis and other blue states around the country. And so what we're going to do, we have to bring more men and women on the ground to ensure they can still conduct these operations, but do so in a safe and orderly fashion.
Well, that's Tricia McLaughlin. She's Assistant Secretary for Public Affairs at Department of Homeland Security. Tricia, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Ben.
Meanwhile, blue state governance in other places, not going well either. According to an editorial at the New York Post, Kathy Hochul has signed off on a bill that they say will all but guarantee more child abuse in the state of New York in the name of fixing racial disparities in the child welfare system. The new law bars callers to the city administration for child services from leaving tips anonymously, which sounds insane to me. Why? Because it turns out that they say that these tips, quote, drive inexcusable racial disparities that disproportionately impact Black and brown families by leading to unnecessary interactions with child welfare services. So they apparently are supposing that a bunch of KKK members are calling up the Administration for Children's Services and saying that the Black guy down the hall is beating his kid, and it's not true. So now they don't want you to leave an anonymous tip. You have to actually leave your name. Advocates say that anonymity lets abusive exes and vindictive or racist landlords, neighbors, and so on use ACS to harass innocent parents with disruptive probes. But the actual reality is that if you hand over your name and your phone number, even if there's a promise that your identity won't be revealed publicly, will not just discourage bogus tips, it will discourage all tips. Because even though they say they're not releasing it publicly, I mean, are you sure? If there's a guy who you think is homicidal down the hall and you call in a tip and they make you give your name, are you sure he's never going to get that it was you who turned him in? As Naomi Shafee Riley has pointed out in the New York Post, Black children are more than 3 times as likely to die by abuse and neglect than their white peers. Whatever the reasons for this, it means preventing abuse of course, is going to disproportionately impact black families. But again, this is when DEI is taken to its fullest extent, it can absolutely turn deadly. Meanwhile, the Supreme Court of the United States took up yesterday a case from Idaho and West Virginia called Little versus Hecox. It involves an adult biological male named Lindsay Hecox who sought to compete against the women at Boise State University. And another case in which a teenager, who is a boy who says he's a girl, wanted to compete against the girls. The athlete's briefs to the justices dispute that trans players have an unqualified advantage over female competitors. This is silly, of course. It'll be interesting to see how the Supreme Court of the United States rules on this. Ruling in favor of the states would make it so legislatures can make common sense rules on transgenderism in athletics. More than half of states have already decided that they want to protect girls' sports. The Supreme Court, I would think, almost guaranteed to rule in favor of these states and localities attempting to protect girls from boys playing against them on their sports teams. And meanwhile, the situation in Iran continues to percolate. A lot of rumors that the Iranian government is going to move over the course of the next couple days in particular to completely shut down the protests, by which we mean mass murder everybody. According to the Wall Street Journal, the White House is weighing Iran's nuclear talks offer. This seems foolish to me. What exactly is it that Tehran would offer that would be in any way credible? What is the thing that would be in any way credible? They have lied every step of the way. They are quickly seeking to rebuild their missile and nuclear facilities. What could they do at this point that would convince the United States and its allies that they don't have nuclear ambitions, that they aren't rebuilding their ballistic missile programs? All Iran is attempting to do right now is delay for a couple of days while they kill everybody. That is pretty obvious. Unsurprisingly, there is some conflict inside, according to the Wall Street Journal, the top echelons of the administration. President Trump is leaning toward authorizing fresh military strikes because his instincts are excellent when it comes to the Middle East, as he has proved over and over again. The Abraham Accords and the 12-Day War and the end of the Gaza War being excellent examples. However, some senior administration aides, led by the vice president, are urging President Trump to try diplomacy before retaliating against Iran for killing protesters. For how long? For how long? I mean, really, Iran could have called at any time. Why precisely should you wait while they mow down the protesters by the hundreds or thousands instead of supporting the protesters? What is the goal you seek? And why does the timeline not? What is the timeline here? Speaking on Sunday to reporters on Air Force One, President Trump said that Tehran messaged Washington a day earlier that it was willing to enter negotiations over its years-long nuclear program. President Trump said a meeting is being set up, but that the United States was still looking at very strong options he could authorize before discussions. Well, if they wanted to, negotiate, maybe a precondition for the negotiation would be don't murder your protesters and turn the internet back on. How about that? How about you want to negotiate? You don't want the United States to, say, ship guns to the dissidents, or to take your oil tankers, or to perform any sort of military strike on IRGC facilities? How about you open up the internet and stop killing people? How about set that as a precondition to talks? Not unconditional talks while you murder all of the people who are putting pressure on the regime. President Trump supposedly will meet with senior aides to determine his approach. The options could include ordering military strikes on regime sites or launching cyber attacks, approving new sanctions, boosting anti-regime accounts online. Vice President Vance, according to the Wall Street Journal, while generally resistant to engaging in conflicts, as opposed to whom? I think most people are not generally in favor of engaging in conflicts for their own sake, remains open to striking Iran, according to a person familiar with his thinking, believing the country is a threat to the United States. Well, I'm glad that he has changed his mind about that, because obviously he took the opposite position originally with regard to striking Fordo. The United States does not currently have an aircraft carrier in the Middle East. The United States could still use bombers, Air Force jet fighters, or naval assets to strike Iran. Iranian officials are saying that they might attack the Americans. If they did that, that would be the end of the regime, bar none, end of story. So they're not going to do that in any serious way. Well, joining us on the line to discuss all of this is retired Vice Admiral Robert Harward, senior national security expert with firsthand experience inside Iran. He actually grew up in Iran and was asked by President Trump to serve as national security advisor. Vice Admiral, thanks so much for the time. Really appreciate it.
Good to be with you, Ben. Thank you.
So let's talk about what's going on in Iran. Obviously, these are ground-shaking moments that we're witnessing in Iran. What's the serious possibility that the Iranian regime topples? What would it take for that to happen?
Support of the Iranian people. It's got to happen from within. And they have, I think what's different now, we've seen snippets of this with the Green movement in 2009, the terrible protests after Amin, what she experienced. But now you have the bazaars, the guys who run the markets, the guys who run the business. You have politicians, you have the everyday folk. Everyone's behind it now. So you have a mass you'd not been before. So the numbers are much different now. Number two is, but we got to help enable them. I think President Trump, in his statement that we stand behind and support the people of Iran, yet hold the regime accountable, is a big change as well. So I think there are numerous steps and entities, not only the U.S., but other our allies in the region, such as Israel and others. There's steps we can take to support the people of Iran and really bring this long overdue change to fruition. So in my mind, it's not a if, this is more when.
So I want to get to how a change would actually occur, what would be necessary to push it in a second. First, I want to point out that something really different is going on this time because the circumstances have changed. Not only have the sanctions placed on the Iranian government by the Trump administration in term one and then reimposed in term two absolutely destroyed the Iranian economy. I mean, the rial is basically worthless. I mean, it is a fraction of a cent of an American dollar at this point. The economy there is so bad that they were actively talking about shifting the entire population of Tehran out of Tehran and not making it their capital anymore, thanks to water and power shortages. But also the guarantee, the sort of quiet guarantee that the mullahs made was that Iran would at least be a military powerhouse capable of spreading its tentacles all over the region. Since October 7th, obviously, Iran's tentacles have been chopped off one by one by the IDF, culminating in that 12-day war, which itself culminated in President Trump ordering that incredible sortie against the Fordo nuclear facility with the B-2. And so that means that just on a military level, it seems as though the population knows that the IRGC, when they're not shooting Iranian citizens, are a paper tiger abroad.
That's exactly right. All the lies have been illustrated to be lies. Not only are they failed militarily, they've failed governance. They're not taking care of the Iranian people, and they've had to suffer under this regime for decades. And it's reached a real boiling point now where there is an opportunity for them to drive that change. So I couldn't agree with you more. And I think as we came out of the war in Iraq, many administrations were afraid to be engaged, did not want to use force. They didn't want to be embroiled in the Middle East and saw this as a potential conflict. So they used a policy of accommodation and appeasement. You're back to an administration that understands realpolitik, national security that's not driven by ideology, but by common sense. And they're willing to use force to reinforce those national security interests. And if you find an government in Iran that provides for their people, wants to grow and prosper, as they did under the Shah in the 60s and 70s, it's saying not only the geopolitical context of the region, but broader, because our adversaries rely on them to be a part of their axis of evil that has now been deteriorated and eradicated. So yeah, it changes everything, Ben.
So when we look at the actual mechanics of how a change would be effectuated, obviously, if the Iranian people are able to gain control, for example, of military bases, take over the weaponry, then everything changes. But one of the big questions, and this has happened multiple times, it's why I think a lot of people are still extremely worried, as they should be, is that the IRGC just comes out of the shadows, turns off the internet, and shoots everybody. And it seems as though that is what the IRGC is in the middle of engaging in right now. The internet has been down for days on end at this point. They're trying to turn Iran into a black box where nobody can find out what's happening. President Trump has said that if there's evidence that there are mass shootings being carried out by the IRGC, he will act. The question becomes, what sort of action would be sufficient to sort of allow for the final cracks to emerge in this edifice? There's been some talk, for example, about going after the Iranian tankers that are in the Gulf of Aden, taking their oil ships, preventing them from being able to export. The Iranian economy is already trashed. And so whether or not that makes a big difference is a question up for debate, I suppose. If you were advising the president, what sort of action would you be looking at in order to help the protesters effectuate their goals here?
I think you've hit one of those rheostats. Not only have we sanctioned the oil, but if we embargo it, we stop it. That's additional pressure on the regime. I got to remember, I was in Frankfurt airport a few months ago, and I'm listening to an Iranian on his phone talking to his boss. Hey, sir, I can't sell stuff because, we're sanctioned and all. And so when I got off the phone, I talked to him. I said, how bad's it in Iran? He said, look, they're murdering any dissidents. It's horrible. But he said to me, and you'll like this one, Ben, this would never happen in the United States. I go, why? Because you guys have guns. Your government can't. So this Iranian knew our Second Amendment and knew why we have guns more than that. So if I could get 1 million guns and 10 million rounds of ammo into the dissidents so that they're armed to fight. And it's not just the IRGC. Don't forget I think one of the most important components of this is the Bashish. The volunteer militia has been that kind of intel apparatus at the very tactical level, pointing out and identifying. So if we can get the Bashish to flip and be part of the solution, not the problem, that presents a big threat to the IRGC. And the military, professional military, which is sometimes at odds with the IRGC, how do we get them to flip? So I think armed force going after these different entities of power that the regime has. And so similar to where we disbanded the military in Iraq, we may here be able to use a professional military to go after the IRGC. So I think all those elements of power we can go after directly and indirectly. I would do indirectly first as opposed to any strikes. And those strikes would be focused on those elements of power that have the least chance of flipping, being the IRGC, so to speak. So I think this administration has shown they're willing to do that. The president does what he says he's going to do, and he's done that in Venezuela. So the people in Iran are hearing that. And I think for the regime, it's a do or die. So how they leverage and build those building blocks and enhance that rheostat to crank up the heat is the solution here.
So as you say, the president has said over and over and over, this is a red line. The red line clearly has been violated at this point and continues to be violated. And so the question, again, becomes what the president is willing and able to do. Obviously, no one here, and I've said this 1,000 times, no one is talking about an Iraq-style invasion of Iran. There are a bunch of people out there who are lying and saying that so that the United States does nothing because they present a false choice between an Iraq-style full-scale occupation of Iran, which is totally unnecessary since the population does not want the current regime. And as you mentioned, there are people inside the military apparatus, not the IRGC, but the actual Iranian military, who are not in favor of the IRGC or the malocracy. So these are apples and oranges comparisons. One of the concerns that's been put forward has been the possibility of an Iranian counterstrike. So Iran, of course, has been threatening to fire a missile barrage at Israel. They, of course, did that during the 12-day war to some minor effect. Did some property damage, killed a few people, but not overwhelming force by any stretch. They are suggesting, of course, that they will fire directly at American bases in places presumably like Kuwait, possibly like Qatar, or on the Iraqi border in Erbil. How much should we take those threats seriously, and how significant would those threats be?
Look, we've seen them do those strikes in Israel, Qatar, and other places, and it's been very ineffective. And so to me, if they go to that step, that would justify our ability to strike and take out not only their military, the IRGC, if anything, we want to. So that to me would represent their last straw, understanding that it's do or die for them. And we've been very effective in countering those. So I think our capabilities far exceed them, and the fact that they have no air defenses, so anyone can fly over the country, we could strike at anything, just illustrates again how vulnerable that is. So I think you always got to take credibility in their statement, but understanding there's really not the bang they had before under those threats. And again, I think that would really be the final straw that would end all this. But again, if you want long-lasting security and stability in Iran, it has to come from within. So just like our adversaries for decades have been coming out at us asymmetrically because they know they did and would lose in direct military confrontation, I still think that's the situation here. And we're best supported by helping the Iranian people bring this to closure.
So, Vice Admiral, here's the $100,000 question. What is the chance that this actually succeeds. Obviously, this is not our first round here with major Iranian protests. We saw them in 2009. This current round actually really started in about 2022 and has kind of increased over the course of the last 3 years or so. What are the real chances that the Iranian regime falls, and how quickly would that happen?
I won't want a timeline, but yes, it's going to happen. If we and our allies, Israel, support it, it will happen. And in my opinion, we should not squander this opportunity. We need to bring this to fruition. It's long overdue, and it just changes everything. So we need to support the Iranian people and bring this to closure.
Well, it's Vice Admiral Robert Harward, national security expert with firsthand experience inside Iran. Vice Admiral, thank you so much for your time and your insight.
Thanks, Ben. Good to be with you.
Alrighty, folks, coming up, the show continues for our members. Democrats seem to be changing their tune about Iran and Hamas. Weird. Remember, in order to watch, you have to be a member. If you're not a member, become a member. Use code Shapiro at checkout for 2 months free on all annual plans. Click that link in the description and join us.